Do you avoid tough problems and shy away from a debate? Do you think uncertainty limits potential? Well, neither does the University of Chicago Booth School of Business. At Booth, they believe in asking questions and questioning answers. With campuses in Chicago, London, and Hong Kong, the Booth MBA is for people who see challenges as opportunities and want the skills to make positive change in any market, anywhere in the world. Ready to find your community? Search chicagobooth.edu today to learn more. When you think about the people working on the ground to address poverty, you probably picture healthcare workers, activists, and maybe not-for-profit workers. But you probably don't think of economists. Well, Professor Michael Kremer wants to change that.
People often think of economists as often an ivory tower, sort of looking at data that they had no involvement in collecting.
Kremer, who is now an economist at the University of Chicago, previously at Harvard, won a Nobel Prize in 2019 with two MIT scholars for their experimental approach to alleviating global poverty.
This year's laureates have shown that it's best to break down this daunting issue into smaller, more precise questions. Questions you can credibly answer. And the most credible way of answering them is to try particular interventions in field experiments. This experimental approach has completely reshaped research in development economics.
That approach involves getting out of the lab.
You're spending time in the field talking to teachers, to students, or to farmers, to nonprofit organization workers or government workers, and that gives you a richer sense of context.
When you're dealing with the problems of global poverty, it can be difficult to isolate real solutions. There are so many factors surrounding any policy or project that figuring out the causal relationship between an intervention and an improvement in people's lives is not always obvious.
Things we think are common sense, sometimes they turn out to be right, sometimes they turn out to be wrong. And things that we thought would have minimal impact or no impact turn out to have a big impact. I think it's just good to maintain some humility about the degree of confidence that we have about things that we believe.
That's why the experimental approach is crucial. Kremer conducts randomized controlled trials to isolate results.
Doing the experiments forces the researcher, and I say forces because I think a lot of economists didn't start out wanting to.
Right.
They sort of had to be forced to spend time in the field. But once you're doing that, then you start to think more broadly and you realize other things that are going on.
From the University of Chicago Podcast Network, this is Big Brains, a show about the pioneering research and pivotal breakthroughs that are reshaping our world. Today, innovative approaches to old problems in economics. I'm your host, Paul Rand. Michael Kremer's approach to economics is unusual, or at least it was, until he made it mainstream. That story starts all the way back before he was even in graduate school. He was a high school teacher in Kenya, and he would return years later to find a connection he had made at an NGO, the International Child Support Fund, telling him about an idea they had to improve some schools that they worked with.
This was a rural area of Kenya, pretty poor. There were pretty few textbooks in the school. So I think on average, that time in these rural schools, one textbook for every 17 pupils. So in that environment, it's common sense. And I certainly believe that one of the most cost-effective things that could be done to promote learning was to provide textbooks for kids.
Seems logical.
It does. And there was actually a debate in the economics of education about the impact of spending. And some people, if you want to crudely characterize it, sort of liberals would say, hey, you need to spend more money. And conservatives would say, it's really not about the money. It's more about getting better incentives for teachers and for administrators. Even the people who are generally pretty skeptical about funding believed that if you had a shortage of textbooks, remedying that shortage of textbooks would increase learning.
More textbooks equals more learning, equals better students, equals less poverty. All that makes sense, right? But how could you know for sure? A randomized controlled trial, the experimental approach.
So they had a limited amount of money, and they did something that I think was actually pretty brave they thought, well, we're going to try to carefully evaluate the impact of what we're doing. Rather than assuming we've got all the right answers, we're going to try to test it. So they chose twice as many schools, and they introduced the program, at least initially, in a subset of those schools. That allowed us to compare the schools that got the textbooks with those that didn't. And having taught high school in this area, I was initially really surprised when we saw the results. So we looked at the impact on average test scores, and we didn't really see any impact.
No impact. The assumptions were wrong. Now some economists might have said, well, there you go. Textbooks don't really matter for those students, and funding isn't really important.
When you get a paradoxical result from a randomized trial, I think there's a tendency, if you're thinking a particular framework, to try and make everything fit inside that framework. If you're in a situation where if you just saw a correlation in the data, we could come up with some story about how it's all explained by expenditure and incentives. But when you get some result that, like this textbook result, that you weren't expecting, but you can't really make go away and pretend isn't there, you have to question not just what the impact is of a particular program, but you have to think about, well, what's really going on here?
And this is where the other factor of the experimental approach becomes important, being on the ground and truly understanding the context.
And then if you are familiar with the context, then you can say, what are some other hypotheses? So I thought about what could be going on here. And we were missing a really important question, which is, what's the organization of the curriculum? Is the curriculum set to the typical student, or is it set to correspond to some international standards or to some colonial pattern in a way that's actually leaving the typical kid behind?
Everyone had assumed that the problem was a lack of textbooks, but by ruling that out with a trial, they could dig deeper to discover the real issue.
So in Kenya, as in many former British colonies, school is taught in English. More generally, the school system is oriented towards the top performing students. So if you imagine being taught in your third language, and then these kids are very poor, they might need to help out at home sometimes. There's all sorts of pretty bad disease environment with malaria, HIV was pretty bad, other intestinal worms, which used to be a big problem in the US, but are no longer. So they miss school a lot. It's pretty easy to fall behind. And the curriculum is set at a pretty,
high level.
Yeah, at a pretty high level. Basically, I would say it's pretty similar to what I experienced in the US. And so the hypothesis, and this is just a hypothesis, was that if you fall behind, it's pretty hard to benefit from textbooks that are geared to the official curriculum and in your third language. How do we try to get a handle on this? Well, partly we did that by looking at the data from this experiment. And we saw the kids who started out on the pretest and performed well in the pretest and hadn't really fallen behind the official curriculum, they actually showed big gains in the schools that had the textbooks versus those where the textbooks hadn't come in yet. But for the typical kid, there wasn't that gain. So that suggested that maybe there was a larger issue here. It wasn't that textbooks should be able to work, still believe in common sense, but these particular textbooks in this particular environment weren't doing it.
It turned out they had been throwing a textbook-shaped solution at a curriculum-shaped problem.
And then what we found was that you could actually rapidly catch up to the official curriculum. There were huge gains to providing some either remedial education or an approach that's been called teaching at the right level. And this is now being used, quite widely. And I think a lot of kids are gaining. I think this is an example where I don't think the nonprofit organization did the wrong thing in giving textbooks. It was a reasonable thing to do. But they actually tested to try and look what was the impact of this. And then we learned, and then that's something that can be adopted by many different governments in terms of how they organize their school system and can generate benefits for many countries.
This wasn't the only randomized controlled trial that Kremer did in Kenya. When the NGO he was working with came up with another intervention, Kremer saw another opportunity. This one surprised everybody even more, and it involved an issue that no one was focusing on, but they discovered what was actually holding students back. It was worms. So can I ask you just a basic question? Why are worms such a big deal in Kenya? What does it do to kids?
These are worms like hookworm, whipworm, roundworm. These are worms that enter your body through, for example, your feet or your hands. If your hands are exposed to contamination. They're very, very common in this part of Kenya. 90% of kids had them, or they were common. They're not the worst health problem in the world. They don't typically kill people. There's lots of there's malaria, there's HIV, lots of other things that will kill you. But you can sort of understand why it might not have been top of the agenda of the health ministry. Also, why the education officials might have thought, this is really a health problem. And just as background, the treatment for deworming is extraordinarily inexpensive. 2 cents for the most common worms, it's 2 cents per dose. Well, the World Health Organization had actually recommended that in areas where worms were common, although the medicine's really cheap, it's pretty expensive to test somebody. You need to take a stool sample, send that to a lab, get the results back, find that's just not cheap and it's not easy. Okay. So what the World Health Organization was recommending was that environments where there are lots of worms, just go to the schools and treat everybody. And because the medicine is very safe. So this is what the nonprofit organization tried. And this was the opposite of the textbook case. Common sense.
Very much, right?
Yeah, exactly. The nonprofit organization, they started out very small. They started out working in 7 schools. They then were going to expand, and eventually we're going to try to introduce this program of treating the worms in 75 schools. But they started out in 25, then they extended to another 25, and so on. The partway through, we could compare the schools where the deworming treatment had already been provided to those where it hadn't.
Basically, everyone was missing an intervention that was right under their nose.
What we found was we saw that school absences went way down by about a quarter.
Just by deworming people.
Yeah, exactly. And kids were missing a lot of school. So this was, and there are a lot of factors. I mentioned before, malaria, economic issues like the HIV for the parents, and then the kids have to stay home and take care of their siblings or work. So we didn't think that treating worms alone would have such a big impact. But that was what the data said. We also saw that beyond that, it wasn't just the kids who got deworming medicine. There was some evidence of interrupted transmission as well, and that other kids in the same school or even kids in neighboring schools seemed to benefit. We saw reductions in worm load in other kids in the same school and in kids in nearby neighboring schools. So when you add up all these effects, it looked like a very cost-effective way to boost school attendance.
And so you were saying earlier, Michael, that these kids were missing a lot of school, but actually they're now having more time in school. And I'm assuming what you found is that their school performance performed because of that additional time in school. Is that right?
It was quite interesting. We saw that everybody went to school more years. We've recently done a follow-up study, and we followed up these same kids really now 20 years later.
So 20 years later, you've continued the experiment. That's kind of remarkable, isn't it?
Yeah, there was a lot of work involved in finding these kids 20 years later. And we did work throughout the period to try to get interim results. But now we know what the impact is, not just on education, but actually long-run outcomes like earnings and how much consumption people have. And what we find is roughly about a 15% increase in earnings and in consumption, which, look, I don't want to get the wrong idea. This is not going to turn Kenya into Singapore, but this is a very meaningful.
15% is quite meaningful, I would bet.
Yeah, exactly. If you think about increasing your own income 15%, that would be pretty nice.
Yeah.
And this is medicine that costs 2 cents a dose, and if you count in the delivery costs and so on, maybe 50 cents per person. So an incredible rate of return as an investment.
And why is it that deworming had such an impact on income, do you think?
But it's a great question. And to be honest, I don't think we fully understand it. There are a number of possible explanations. Partly it could be the impact on education. But we saw a bigger impact on education for the girls than for the boys. And yet we saw a bigger impact on earnings and economic outcomes for the boys. I think it also could just be that if you have more energy, maybe you're able to take on certain types of jobs that you wouldn't be able to take on otherwise. And maybe that has a persistent effect. One clue is in the early results, in the interim results, there was a change in the type of jobs that people had. For example, off of a pretty low baseline, there was an increase in the chance people would work in manufacturing. This wasn't manufacturing as in working in an auto factory, but it was maybe working in a mill to process grain, sort of a local mill, something like that.
much like the textbooks, isolating deworming's effect on school attendance and income gives other countries and NGOs important data about what might work in their own communities. And Kremer says that the experiment gives us two big lessons for the field of development economics. First, health interventions should be preventative and free.
The nonprofit organization that did this work, they had a general philosophy, as a lot of organizations did at the time, that it's very important to charge. And that if you give stuff away for free, that's going to create negative consequences, and we need to charge at least something.
Because people wouldn't appreciate or they wouldn't take the seriousness of it or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. That was their feeling. And as I say, it was very widespread at the time. We talked to them, and they decided they were going to actually, again, try to look and see if their assumptions were correct. And they tried providing it for free in some schools. And what we saw was there was a huge drop-off in take-up in the schools where they put even a modest charge compared to the schools where it was for free. So it turns out that this is something that isn't just the case for deworming medicine. It's been found for using mosquito nets against malaria, for many other preventive health behaviors. So I think this is something where now there's actually been a big change. I think that the standard now is for governments and other organizations to provide at least the cheapest and most effective preventive health products for free.
Second, it's crucial to understand the communities and the people that you're working with.
I think the reason why this has had a big impact on economics is not just because it allows us to more cleanly isolate the impact of a particular program. I think it's also because it means the researchers really getting involved with practical specific problems and is working with not just on their own analyzing a data set, but they're talking to whether it's the people that they're being interviewed to collect the data from, whether it's the government officials or the teachers or in some cases to other social scientists or other, to healthcare experts. And having that bigger context allows you to think about questions, maybe it forces you to think about questions differently than you were.
Kremer's work challenging the assumptions of how we fight poverty is what he won the Nobel Prize for in 2019. But it's not the only work he does. After the break, Kremer's work on founding new nonprofits and speeding up the development of vaccines. Big Brains is supported by the University of Chicago's annual Giving Day. Do you want to be a part of the pioneering research you hear on this show? Join us for Giving Day, 24 hours when we celebrate and support the people, ideas, and programs at UChicago who are reshaping the world and changing our lives. It's all happening April 21st and April 22nd from noon until noon. Make your gift at give.uchicago.edu/count. Your contribution could make the research you hear on our next episode a reality. Are you interested in social impact? So is the Restandi Center for Social Sector Innovation at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. Learn from UChicago faculty and social sector leaders at Onboard 2021. Free, interactive online sessions on nonprofit strategy and board governance begin April 9th. Register at chicagobooth.edu/onboard2021. Another aspect of your work and your career that's just so interesting to me is that you're spending time not only founding, but being very active in nonprofits. So you're not only studying, but you're applying. And I wonder if I can trouble you just to talk a little bit about how you came to some of those decisions, specifically about one of the NGOs you founded called Precision Agricultural.
So, one area where I've done some research was on the impact of providing information to farmers. I grew up in Kansas. In the U.S., there's extensive systems for agricultural extension, for giving the latest scientific information to farmers so they can address fertilizer or pests. That system works pretty well in the U.S. But in developing countries, there often aren't strong systems in place for that. And we've seen a big change across the world through adoption of mobile phones. And that's true even in pretty low-income countries. So even in Kenya, most people have mobile phones now. And they might not be smartphones, but they've got a basic phone. And that means that it's possible to deliver information to farmers that is based on their location. Certainly, you can deliver information that's timed to a particular time in the agricultural season, but also can be timed around outbreaks of new pests. So we did some trials of what was the impact of providing information to farmers. And what we found was that it really did affect farmer behavior. Again, I don't want to claim that this is a magical effect or, it's transforming things, but it's in some ways a little bit like the deworming medicine. It's very cheap to send these mobile phone messages.
Okay.
So even if some farmers change their behavior in response and say adopt, so a big problem in this area was acidic soils, and you can address that using lime to sort of restore the pH balance. And with even some farmers changing behavior in this way, the rate of return, as economists would think about it, the benefit per dollar spent can just be immense, sort of a 10 to 1, these are rough numbers, but we'd estimate 10 to 1 ratio. So this was something that could have a very big benefit cost ratio. And I'd been doing work in Kenya. Another researcher, Sean Cole, had done similar work in India, found similar results. And so I was approached by a philanthropist, and we decided to form an NGO that would try to work with, in the NGO, Precision Development works with governments, with nonprofit organizations, with private firms.
Did this surprise you that you all of a sudden were in the NGO business?
I think that the image of economists 30 years ago and my image of what I would do when I went to graduate school was not that I'd be involved in nonprofit organizations. I think in some ways, if you think about, say, biotech or computer science, obviously a lot of people, there are things coming out of those that are practically useful. And maybe we're finally getting to the stage of economics.
Kremer's desire to find practical solutions goes beyond randomized controlled trials and founding NGOs. He's also helped upend the economics of vaccines, which is obviously extremely relevant today. The model he's helped develop is called the Advanced Market Commitment.
And was used for something called pneumococcus vaccine.
There are some viruses and bacteria that companies don't want to invest the R&D time in to create vaccines because they don't see a way to make money on them. Advanced market commitments are essentially contracts, usually offered by governments or donors, that guarantee a viable market for a vaccine once it's successfully developed.
So $1.5 billion was set aside to help finance the purchase of pneumococcus vaccine as a way to encourage companies to invest in that.
These commitments create a financial incentive for the private sector to develop new vaccines for diseases that affect developing countries.
And that approach was successful. Vaccines were developed. They're reaching 700,000. They've estimated to save 700,000 lives.
When COVID-19 hit, Kremer immediately recognized the same issues around incentives within the private sector.
There's some decisions which are risky for a private firm. When do you start the construction? Do you construct this big factory? And it's pretty expensive to construct these factories. Do you start constructing the factory before you have the results of the trial, or do you wait till after the trial and then start the construction?
Right.
Well, normally what the private sector does is they wait till afterwards. This is a case where that might slow things down by 3 months, by 6 months. The benefits of speeding up access to a vaccine, obviously there are huge benefits in human lives. The economic impact of this is huge. The estimates are that the world is losing $500 billion just in short-run GDP losses alone. And if you take a more comprehensive measure that includes long-run health costs in education, you get much, much bigger numbers. So one study just for the US estimates $800 billion every month.
Wow.
So that means it's from an economic point of view alone, if we can do anything to accelerate the end of the pandemic, for example, by speeding up vaccination, it's almost surely going to be worth it. It's worth putting huge amounts of resources into it. And so both getting larger scale capacity and making sure that capacity gets installed early on is super valuable from a societal point of view. Now, it's valuable for a private firm as well, but it's a lot more profitable for society. I would say profitable. The value to society greatly exceeds the value to a private firm. If we put in enough factory capacity to produce one workforce a year, that's worth $1,700 to society. We estimate.
When did you propose this, Michael?
I think it was just around the time. Actually, warp speed was announced shortly thereafter.
Yeah.
So it was very much. The warp speed was trying to do this. We advocated actually for a program that would have been larger scale than warp speed. That would have taken, invested even more.
Kremer was arguing that we needed to commit to investing in vaccine production capacity, even before we had a viable vaccine, so we could shave months off the wait for vaccines. This largely didn't end up happening, and Kremer says we could have ended up in a situation where we were waiting even longer than we are now to vaccinate everyone. We just got lucky.
I think we got really lucky. It turned out that a bunch of different vaccines worked. When we did our modeling for this, we actually assumed a pretty low chance that they would work. But it was, even if you assumed a low chance, this was a no-brainer as an investment decision. It turned out that we got lucky and a bunch of them worked. We hope we'll be able to vaccinate the U.S. by the end of the summer. But from a world point of view, we need a lot more production capacity.
Can I ask you, what was the reaction to the study and the proposal that you all made?
I think it's glass half full, glass half empty.
Okay. Yeah.
There were a lot of investments. I think the U.S. was one of the leaders in this. UK as well. Both the U.S. and UK invested a lot in vaccines, and we're seeing the benefits. We called for a lot more investment than was actually made. And, I think it would have been better if there was more.
Kremer says that the lessons we learned here are vital, and that in the future, like with advanced market commitments, vaccine buyers should invest in manufacturing capacity early for the right to buy doses at marginal cost. But the issue of how to ramp up COVID-19 vaccine production today is still far from over. Although wealthy Western countries are expecting to be vaccinated by summer, this is not the case for developing countries. Kremer's team is still working to think of ways to make production even more efficient.
Imagine you hire a contractor to do some work in your house. You could say, hey, I want the kitchen remodeled in the following way. Well, the contractor may come back and say, yeah, I was going to try and get it done by April 15th, but it's not ready. I'm going to need it in 6 more weeks.
That would never happen, by the way.
Exactly. 6 more weeks waiting for your house is not ready is a pain. But 6 more weeks when 200,000 people are dying of COVID each month, and where the economy is just in terrible shape because of it, that's a disaster. So you really want to specify the contract in ways that are going to give the company incentives to invest early and to invest at large scale. We thought that the best way to do that was to have the contracts explicitly include not just the doses, not just the dates, but
the speed.
But to get speed, actually the capacity installation.
Got it.
Whether it's building or repurposing the factories, because otherwise you might do this in a contract with a penalty clause, right? If you don't get it done by such and such a day, there's some penalty or bonus for early delivery. Problem is, to match the incentives, you need very big penalties or bonuses, and that's just too risky. Companies are, and even for the government, they're going to be reluctant to sign that. So, and there are a lot of factors that are outside their control. The testing could be delayed by adverse events, say, that shut down the trials. So we thought the best way to do this was to explicitly include goals for installation of the capacity, which is not perfectly under the control of the companies, but more so than some other efforts. So if you write a contract and you just say, we want this many doses, well, it's then in the incentive of the firm. If you just look purely at the commercial incentives of the firms, I'm not claiming that they're not motivated by other factors, but from a purely commercial point of view, well, maybe don't build the biggest factory. Build a factory that your confident you can build, the factory that you can build, at a modest cost, but maybe don't go shut down some other factory and entirely repurpose it to this if that's going to be very expensive and give up some other product that's really valuable. You'll go, maybe it'll go, look, they did go much beyond what they'd ever done historically. They should get credit for that. But really, this is a national emergency, and it's a global emergency. And going even further to expand capacity would have been worth it from society's point of view.
You're newer to the University of Chicago, and you've come into a Becker-Friedman Institute here at the university, and you're launching a brand new lab called the Development Innovation Lab. And I wonder if you can tell me a little bit about what you're planning on doing.
So the idea of the lab is very much along the lines we've been discussing. The idea is to use the tools of economics to try to take on practical problems affecting low and middle income countries. That will often be in ways that are in collaboration with other disciplines, whether that's education researchers or health researchers or agriculture researchers. But often, I think the aim would be to have long-term collaborations with practitioners, whether that's a government agency, whether that's a nonprofit organization or a private firm, to really try to try a variety of different approaches to address problems, carefully measure their impact, and then just keep continually improving, hopefully serving both the needs of our partner organizations, but also generating knowledge, which we would try to disseminate to the world at large.